Next up, we have Catie Camp with Old Houses, New Friends. So welcome Catie up to the stage.
Well, let's see. When I was asked to do this, and I thought, how do you figure out one thing to talk about? Because most of us have very complicated lives. But I have recently returned to Vermont from being away for a number of years, and I'm looking at different things I've done in the past, and I realized I now have a new perspective on something that I did full-time and part-time, and just realized I was much more passionate about than I was at the time. So we're going to review my history as a tour guide in the crazy, wacky tour guide world of Massachusetts. So I think we can start. So these are a number of buildings that I've come in contact through with my life, and I realized that as a child, I thought buildings were part of the environment. And I remember the first time I saw a house being built, I was flabbergasted. I just thought they had always been there. And they all had their own stories, just like people had stories. And I had the fortune of being able to actually live in an amazing building. So for a brief period, well, not brief, 10 years actually when I think about it, but I had the fortune of living in this house. And people would say, oh, do you imagine you lived there and all that? And I realize now that instead I was sharing. It wasn't that I imagined living there, I just loved all the stories associated with it. Now, fortune took me away from Vermont, and I ended up actually driving one day, being lost, frustrated about living in the city, and I saw all this grass. This is actually Watertown, Mass, where I think you grew up for a while. And I saw that green grass and I said, I need to work there because I miss the grass of Vermont. So I called them and they said, oh, sure, we have a job. We have a job as a tour guide. And all I could imagine was my life like this. And I said, oh, I am never wearing a costume. That is not me. And I imagined little old ladies with the title docent and just boring school children the rest of my life. But instead, I was introduced to people like this. These are two of my friends that I met when I lived in Boston. They have names that suit being a tour guide. This is Camille Arbogast and Prentice Crozier. Very different types of tour guides, but passionate about what they do, and they sort of infused me with that passion. Because I had always loved history, and I'd always loved houses, so I thought, why not? So they referred me from working at that one house to also working at this house. I soon discovered different things about being a tour guide. At this house, I was introduced to the booty. I don't know if any of you have had to experience the booty. I was sometimes criticized by my boss because if people forget their booties, I didn't make them put them back on. It was sort of a symbol of an old style of doing tours. But, you know, they had expensive rugs, so we would do it, you know. But yes, so in this building, I learned a lot about being a tour guide. One day I was in this room, and a door similar to this over here actually fell right out. Just as I was demonstrating, the door here came down as I was talking about the beautiful musical instruments. So I held it dramatically and said to the guide, to the people on my tour, I know you're not supposed to leave me here alone, but go find somebody. So I then was promoted to be allowed to do walking tours. Now, in the city of Boston, being part of the walking tour community is huge. That other one showed a street in Boston, which is the center of the African American community. And it was wonderful to be able to introduce that whole rich history of the South Slope of Boston to people. Tourists would come from everywhere. Sometimes you'd do 3 or 4 tours a day running around, and you'd be introduced to all these beautiful houses. Then I decided, all right, I'm now ready to branch out to working for other companies or organizations, nonprofits. This is the Old Manse in Concord. And again, sort of in the hierarchy of these tour guide world, this was one of the most popular because Concord has so much history. And again, I met interesting people. This is a gentleman who rode his bike back and forth across the country 3 or 4 times. But the Old Manse is where Emerson wrote Nature, the Hawthornes lived there, Thoreau planted a garden there, and he was a student of them, so he came to be a tour guide. Now, one of the organizations I worked for was called Historic New England. It used to be called the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities, but after a while, they thought that was actually not really appropriate, so they changed it to Historic New England. And the house that you just saw is Gropius House, which many people said, that was built in 1938. How can that be an antiquity? But it's part of the rich history of architecture in New England. And it's the first house that I worked in that I thought, oh yeah, I would live there. All of the houses had rich histories of the people who lived there, what was happening in the society then. But this one really moved me. This picture, for instance, if it doesn't go by too fast, that mirror is actually on a clear piece of glass. The Gropiuses had escaped from Nazi Germany. They were very German, but so they built that glass wall. They slept on that side, closed the door, and then left all the windows open because they needed to sleep in very cold weather. But this is back to Gore Place where I started out. This is, believe it or not, 48 acres in the middle of Watertown and Waltham, 10 miles exactly from Logan Airport. But one of the other things that I loved about house museums, and you could see in that big expanse, is that they become a center of the community. The people who work there, in some ways, are very strange. One of them, Prentice, was at our house watching a movie, and he couldn't stop but saying, oh, we have that cup in my museum. Oh, look, no, that dress would not have been invented before that day. So there can be struggles, but there are people that are passionate about what they do, and the people that come on tours are also very interesting. So it brought together my interest in people, my interest in history, and my interest in community. These are some of the people I met along that journey. You can see Prentice and Camille there and some others. These people together, there, as I said, are many itinerant life of being a tour guide. They work in one house for a couple of days, then they drive 80 miles and work in another. There's 18 houses that are served by these people. Some people do 5 or 6 houses. Now, one of the downsides of being acquiring an interest in going on tours and house guides is that you do end up dragging your family to many of them. Some of you may notice or recognize this house. This is Hildene down in southern Vermont, which I had never been to, even though I lived in Vermont for years and years. But once I got introduced to that world and the commitment of the people who work in that world, I said, I gotta go to Hildene. So.